My name is Bruce Kuniholm. I'm a professor of public policy and history at Duke. I'm here with Alex Roland, a professor of history. And we're here to interview General Anthony Zinni, who is the Terry Sanford Distinguished Lecturer at Duke, as part of the Rutherford Oral History program. General Zinni, it's clear that your experience as a platoon commander and company commander in Vietnam were critical to your formative years as a young officer. And I'm wondering if you could give us some insight into how that experience shaped your subsequent thinking, beginning perhaps with why you enlisted in the Marine Corps to begin with, but then how that experience in Vietnam formed and shaped your future thinking.
Well, I came into the Marine Corps my first day literally on campus, and I was told that you had to join the military while you're in college, which wasn't true, but I didn't know that. I joined the platoon leader class, a program that in the Marine Corps that you're in the reserves while you're in college, go away in the summers, and then upon graduation you're commissioned. And of course, this was 1961, and it's well before the buildup in Vietnam, which actually didn't occur until after I was commissioned and at our basic school where we train our lieutenants. And as the war was sort of now moving up towards a stage where there were a large commitment of ground forces there, like all young officers, we were excited. The Marines had gone into the Dominican Republic while we were there, and now Vietnam, the initial landing of Marines up around Chu Lai and later Da Nang. And so we were all anxious to go there to sort of prove our courage and do what we did to join the Marine Corps. I had an unusual first tour. I first went for a year to Camp Lejeune in the 2nd Marine Division, but then I was given orders to the Marine Advisory Unit, really the only second lieutenant, sort of pure second lieutenant without an long enlisted background or specialty like in motor transport, to be assigned to the Advisory Unit. And it was because they had suffered a number of casualties and the troop buildups were getting greater and greater in the north with the Marines, and there was a paucity of officers. And I was sent to the Advisory Unit, normally in a role that a captain would fill, to be an advisor to a Vietnamese Marine battalion. And that experience, first going to the Army Special Warfare School, getting some language training, which actually we were taught by Vietnamese families, and we're in their homes and learned their customs and traditions. Went through a course that, steeped in insurgency and how it's formed, and the doctrine on counterinsurgency at the time, and the different theories, French, British, and others. So I went there with sort of a different preparation and a different assignment than my counterparts, who were all in the north leading platoons and companies. I found myself now wearing the uniform of the Vietnamese with one of their elite units. They had a quartering act, so when we were around villages, we actually moved in and lived with the people. They were part of the National Strike Force of Vietnam, along with the Vietnamese Airborne. So we went all over Vietnam. We saw the war from the Delta all the way up to the DMZ. And it convinced me that this war had a much more complex or deeper set of conditions and circumstances than maybe my counterparts were seeing. And I became more convinced of that when I returned and we talked about the war. I saw the war, first of all, geographically from one end to the other, and there were remarkable differences. But I think most importantly, not only seeing the combat piece of that, and with a very good Vietnamese military unit, but I lived with the people, and I saw it from their eyes. And I really saw that we weren't winning hearts and minds. The people were becoming more and more discouraged. There wasn't anything there for them to die for. Despite the fact we were preaching the promotion of democracy and a new world and freedoms, they were looking back at a government in Saigon with rotating generals and coups and the corruption, and there wasn't enough there for them to see that the hope and count on us, trust us, this will be better. It wasn't there. They were going through the motions, I felt, the military, and the people were not committed to this. And I walked away from that with a belief that unless you understand the culture and unless you're involved in these sorts of circumstances, civil wars or insurgencies, where the side you're promoting has a belief in what you're doing, has a commitment, has an understanding that what you're trying to establish is worth putting their lives on the line, you're going to lose. And I think that we never quite, even though we mouthed the words, we never quite understood how or were effective enough in winning hearts and minds and convincing the people. And I also thought from a military point of view that unless we took the war to the north, there wasn't just bombing and doing things like that. There wasn't enough up there to convince them to back off. So the North, obviously with Ho Chi Minh, the strongest sense of nationalism and commitment and more dedication to their ideology, had a much greater commitment, and nothing really challenged that. I think there's a lesson to be brought forward even to al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. He wasn't challenged in his sanctuary, he wasn't challenged in his base, and unless you bring the conflict to whoever's perpetrating these unacceptable acts toward you, the motivation to back off or quit, maybe like the North Koreans did at the conclusion of the peace talks in the Korean War, that if that doesn't come home, you fight a losing battle if you're going to fight where you're trying to convince the people to commit to fight, while they see their potential enemy or adversary getting away, free from this.
Do you think then that the Vietnam War, with the political constraints it had, that is that we weren't going to escalate any further than we did in the North, and we surely weren't going to invade, was unwinnable?
I think so, because the message we sent, obviously we misread the Chinese-North Vietnamese relationship, and that probably was the driving factor in not taking the war there. Many of the generals, the senior generals, World War II veterans, really wanted to go north. There was always talk about an amphibious invasion to at least cut off the DMZ. And I think as long as we made it clear that we were not going to go north, we weren't going to do anything more than the bombing, we weren't going to bring the war there, I think the North was convinced they were free to move south, to move into Cambodia and Laos, to open bases down in the south and commit to that. Even at the end of the Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong felt they were sacrificed by Giap and others, and there was a lot of dissension, it didn't matter to the North Vietnamese. They could reestablish the insurgency. They basically had a free hand. As we pulled out the first offensive, the Easter offensive, the South Vietnamese actually beat back. Then, of course, we cut support and funding to them, and so the second offensive by the North Vietnamese, they were unable to withstand it. But it said something about the North Vietnamese, belief that this war, they could rest assured and make the assumption it wasn't going to come home to them. But I want to emphasize, it wasn't purely a military, and that being the military dimension, it wasn't purely the military dimension that maybe we got wrong here. But the principal key was the hearts and minds piece. Unless there was something in the South worth fighting for. And you could use examples like the South Korea, where we developed or helped develop a society and a belief in what they had in the South that was worth fighting for. In the beginning of the Korean War, the South kind of folded. The North Koreans were much more aggressive militarily, had a greater advantage. There wasn't that resistance. But we built in the South that kind of spirit and belief in their own system that allowed them to, I think right now we could probably, with the exception of maybe protecting them from weapons of mass destruction and a deterrence or counterforce, they're fully capable on their own to defeat another North Korean invasion conventionally.
General, in Battle Ready, you have a part of the book there that addresses this question of how you extrapolate from experience, and in particular, you acknowledge that your own experience is not necessarily generalizable. Everybody has a different Vietnam that they experience, and I guess one of the questions is how does one on the macro level put all those pieces together? You served with the Vietnamese Marines. It sounds like it was a very positive experience with some very dedicated troops. Some of us had experience with the ARVN where we didn't have that same experience. And the question is how one puts all that together. If the South Vietnamese had consisted of people that had the same mentality as the Vietnamese Marines you were fighting with, it might have been a different outcome.
Well, I think, again, I go back to the Korean example. During the Korean War and maybe in the immediate aftermath, you didn't have a South Korean military that is anywhere near like what it was developed into, that kind of spirit and elan and sense of dedication and commitment to the defense of their country. And you could look across the Korean military forces beyond just the expectations of what you might find in normally elite units like their Marines or airborne, but into their Army and other places, other organizations, you see this spirit. So it can be built, but it has to be built on a foundation of the people believing in the system, that there's something worth this kind of commitment. And I think with the South Vietnamese, that could have happened, but my time with the Vietnamese Marines, we were a political force. The Vietnamese Marines were sent north into I Corps before I got there, the northernmost province of South Vietnam, to put down the Buddhist revolt. They actually attacked the 1st ARVN Division that were basically Buddhist, supporting the government in that move. They were coup meisters. They were the ones that supported whichever general was going to become the next president and effect the next coup. When I was there in the elections of '67, all our battalions, all 6 of them, were pulled back into Saigon to surround the city to determine the outcome of the election. So here you had a force that was not only fierce in battle, but was a political force. It's hard for me to say the motivations were patriotism. It was more this sort of spirit of being elite and being a special force. In my time there, we attacked other South Vietnamese units. I mean, it was not the kind of structure we think about in this country, and it wasn't built upon this faith that the people had in a governmental system and in a system that was going to be fair and deliver to them something worth putting their lives and the lives of their sons on the line for.
How would you rank the performance of the American military and the Marine Corps in general in the Vietnam War?
Well, I think given the fact that the military was thrown into an environment that it was unfamiliar with, I mean, this was a military that was geared to go fight in the Fulda Gap, and fight conventionally, and actually before that was thinking in terms of a battlefield that would have weapons of mass destruction on it. So its structure and organization was very much oriented to that, with some exceptions. I mean, the Marine Corps obviously did a lot of the sort of fire brigade stuff around the world, and as I mentioned, the Dominican Republic and other little firestorms that came up. They weren't really prepared for insurgency. I remember when President Kennedy said, "This will be the way we engage communism around the world. It will be through these sort of surrogate wars, if you will, insurgencies, and we have to prepare for it." He had a military that was very reluctant. In some cases, they sort of took it on. The Army's creation of special forces and their orientation to foreign internal development and understanding insurgency. Most of the rest of the military, felt that this was sort of an additional duty that you could just assume without any real special preparation. So we went onto a battlefield. If you look at the beginnings, we came in there with conventional force. We tried to engage the enemy in conventional battle. We didn't understand an enemy who could pick the time and choosing for the engagement. I think I read a statistic, something like 80 or 85% of the engagements, the enemy initiated them and could break them off pretty much. So we didn't really have the initiative. We couldn't bring him to conventional battle very often. When he did and he was defeated, he learned from it. He was much more adaptive than maybe we were. I think we did learn some things throughout the course of the war. The use of the helicopter, some of the adaptations for the individual soldier on the ground I thought were great. I think that some of the tactical evolutions, the understanding of the enemy and the nature of the fight, we improved as time went along. We had the impact of social issues, though, that affected the military. An unpopular war back home that turned in not to only anti-war, but eventually became anti-military, which I think had a psychological effect. The drug problems, the racial problems, all were spilling over. So there were other dynamics that were affecting morale and this large conscript military that we had suddenly had to increase because of the war. Given all that, I thought that the individual soldier Marine did extremely well there. I commanded an infantry company in 1970, toward the end of the war. Obviously, there were no illusions about the war at that stage of the game, but I still saw the same sort of competence, heroism, and courage and dedication. It wasn't maybe at the beginning this strong sense of patriotism and promoting democracy. It was more now for your buddy and for your unit kind of thing, which always is the base for why soldiers fight and why they fight well. So I think given all those circumstances, it was a remarkable performance by the individual soldier and Marine. And I was certainly proud of the ones I was privileged to command.
Do you think the Marine Corps at the time, and arguably even since then, was organized sort of as an expeditionary force, as a short duration force to go into an area and and fix a problem. Were they well suited to be there permanently for the duration of the war?
Well, I mean, in the Marine Corps' mission, it sort of has the catch-all line, as the president may direct, and of course, in our history, really, I guess, really beginning in the First World War, where the decision was made to contribute major ground forces to join alongside the Army, understanding we didn't have the depth of logistics and firepower and other things that sustain us in a long way and depend on for a long time and depend on others to do that. But I think World War II, Korea, by the time Vietnam came along, we understood that that was a very real kind of capability. I think the Marines can adapt and adjust to that. What the Marines don't like to do is become static. I mean, they are not good at position warfare. It's not in their nature, it's not in their spirit, it's not in their training, it's not in their structure and equipage and logistics and everything else. So in terms of holding ground for a long period of time, being in static defensive positions for a long period of time, that's never been a strength of the Corps. And I don't think maybe it should be. You know.
Let me follow up on a question of how, as a company commander, or I can't remember whether you were a platoon or company commander at the time, the Lance Corporal that you met in the Army Field Hospital south of Da Nang asked you this question, "Sir, why are we here?" And you said you gave him this response, the standard response, and in retrospect, it was not the response that you would like to have given him. What would you have told him? How does one deal with a problem where you're not necessarily believing the rationale that's being used, but you've got to lead men in combat?
Well, you know, of course, we were both wounded at the time, and I was looking throughout the wards for my troops that were wounded with me during the battle that I was injured in. And, you know, I think at that time, I was surprised by the question. I had actually asked my battalion commander the same question a little bit before that, phrased a little bit differently, like how he saw the outcome of this thing. I mean, I couldn't for the life of me. I'm now was in my second tour, and of course in between tours was an instructor at our basic school and teaching counterinsurgency, teaching counter-guerrilla tactics and that sort of thing. So really immersed in this whole struggle. And I couldn't sort out in my mind, given my experiences and what I was reading and learning and everything else, how this was going to turn out. I mean, I didn't see a victory sort of in the classic sense, and I didn't understand, I didn't believe at that point that things remained stagnant, that we were going to find ourselves in some sort of agreeable stalemate. Just didn't make sense. Again, we didn't bring the war to the North, and there was no motivation on their part to do anything but continue the struggle in some fashion. They might go dormant for a while and make a phony peace, but come back. And my battalion commander was one of the brightest individuals I'd ever met. He later became a lieutenant general in the Marine Corps, General Trainer, General Mick Trainer. And I thought, this is somebody who could give me an answer. And he really didn't. He saw it maybe where there would be enclaves that would be secure and protected, maybe around the cities and all, but the countryside would still be for the foreseeable future up for grabs. And there was no really end state that he could articulate. And then when I was asked that question by the Lance Corporal, who obviously, you know, he's a big strapping kid, a big strapping Hawaiian kid that was shot in the ankle and it really had messed up his leg, and, you know, was an athlete and now was looking at this, this terrible wound. You know, to answer him, I was using sort of the same rationale that we had back in the early 60s at a point when it didn't make sense. It sounded hollow to me. And I mean, I could have answered it in a way he would have clearly understood and accepted, that he knew that you're here because the Corps is here. You're here because the Marines are here. I mean, it's enough at that level, and I have a son who's an officer, an infantry officer in the Marine Corps, that understands that, you know, whatever your feelings may be about the conduct of the war, the rationale for the war, when Marines go and you're a Marine, you're there with them. I mean, that's enough. And almost every Marine I've ever met, that's been sufficient to rationale to be there. You're able, as much of a contradiction as it sounds, you're able to separate that political position or feeling from your sense of duty and obligation and sense of unit pride and camaraderie that can bring you to that battlefield and say, at this level, I certainly can do this. I want to bring my troops back home. I want to succeed in my unit mission, and that's enough. He would have certainly understood that, but I was struggling for an answer, you know, for a broader answer, a bigger answer to his question, and maybe in my own mind struggling with it too at the time.
Let me ask one more macro question about Vietnam. You're a student of history, and I assume have read a lot of the histories of the whole U.S. involvement. And if you start from the decision at the time of the Marshall Plan to support, or the Truman Doctrine 46-47, where we ultimately supported the French in Vietnam because we needed their help in opposing the Soviets in Eastern Europe. All the way through decisions by Eisenhower not to send all the troops because Ridgway gave him the list of what it would take. And having had experience as a commanding general of CENTCOM, and you look back at all that, do you see any places where if you'd been in a position to advise presidents, you'd have recommended a decision that might have made a big difference in the course of the war?
Well, I mean, in the current conflict in Iraq, I think looking at that, it certainly had I been in a position as CENTCOM at the time of the decision, I of course retired a year before 9/11 and several years before the actual incursion, I would have said if you're going to do it, first of all, I didn't agree with doing it. I thought Saddam was effectively contained. But if you're going to do this, be clear on what you're about to do. I don't believe we understood what I had learned from almost 2 decades in that part of the world, that the issues you're about to unleash are very complex. I mean, the Sunni Shia, Persian Arab competition, understanding the depth of ethnic and religious differences that could rise from the top. We saw this in the Balkans. We saw it again in Somalia. In Iraq, it was not only within the boundaries of Iraq, but it was region-wide. It could explode and stretch out. It had greater implications for that. I think to understand that when the fragility of that society, that once the Colin Powell example, once you break it, you own it. The Pottery Barn example, that if you go in and you break this, you will own it, especially if you didn't wait or were unable to get a United Nations resolution and a commitment. You certainly, if you did it unilaterally and preemptively, you were going to be stuck with this.
Let me interrupt. Before we get into Iraq,
Sure.
Going back to Vietnam,
Yeah.
in the course of the evolution of the Vietnam War,
Oh, okay.
which is I was
Well, I think in the course of Vietnam, I go back to the point, I think there was a time when we had to stop looking at this as simply an insurgency. We actually had, I mean, we were much clearer in the Korean War about what we faced. Now, there was a debate about whether the whole peninsula, the MacArthur-Truman debate, and whether we wanted to take that on, how it fit in the context of the broader Cold War. But we clearly understood that we had an enemy to the north. I think we kept convincing ourselves that this was an insurgency in the south. And despite the bombings and other things, I mean, if you could have removed the North from the equation, and then, as I said before, committed seriously to hearts and minds programs, which means in being more forceful in the type of governance that was in place, rather than accepting it for what it was, you could have made a difference. I mean, you would have had to do those two things, I believe. You would have had to bring the war home to the North. And they would have had to pay a price. They were not paying a price in terms of the freedom of their ground units and logistics to be concentrated in the South. And in the South, despite mouthing the words again, we didn't truly make a commitment to political, social, and economic development of this country in a way that the people had some hope in the system and were willing to commit to it. What were they watching in Saigon? They were, again, watching these rotating generals and these coups, a very corrupt government. Not an economic system that promised to make their lives better in any way. No real social change. I mean, basically it was a class system. It had its religious differences and other things. There was an elite that sort of ran things in South Vietnam. There was no indication that this was going to be changed by us. Once we come in, we become responsible for those things. And when as a young advisor, when I questioned those sorts of things, that people would say to me, Americans would say to me, well, that's not our business. That's their business. It's their country to run. Well, then you're not going to win this. I mean, it was clear to me you're not going to win it. You can't become a little bit pregnant. You can't walk into a situation that requires truly an occupation and then not take that occupation to its fullest, like we did at the end of World War II in Germany and Japan, where MacArthur worked within the culture but created a new system and was insistent upon some of the changes. We can't go into that society and say we will accept corruption, we will accept the lack of viable governance that the people can feel, motivated to support. We can accept, a corrupt economic system, let that function, and then on the other hand, provide this rhetoric that's meaningless out there about democracy and free market economies and fighting for freedom, because it doesn't make sense. The people can see it. And yet we were deluding ourselves. We were in a state of denial in Vietnam. To me, the words about winning hearts and minds and those kinds of programs and understanding what it took to promote an effective counterinsurgency were ringing hollow, because on the ground, the real tactic was body count. I mean, clearly it was body count. Units were judged by the number of enemy you killed and the ratio of killed. In the end, that was the bottom line. And what struck me about that is that was no recipe for success. The Vietnamese Marines who understood that refused to play the game. When we would go into battle, and I remember a battle leading up to the Tet Offensive, we were engaged with the North Vietnamese regiment, and we had, in the battle, there were a lot of enemy killed. As a matter of fact, we were coming across these mass graves that they had dug behind their positions where they're putting the bodies. And as we broke their lines and were moving through, I was getting call from the American command saying, count the bodies. And my Vietnamese counterpart looked at me like I was crazy. We're not stopping and counting bodies. We don't count bodies. And, there were all sorts of stories about people killed that maybe didn't have a weapon. A weapon became the determination as to whether it was a Viet Cong suspect or real Viet Cong, and military troops putting weapons on there to sort of get the credit, if you will. It became so ridiculous. And I was finding the most elite of the Vietnamese units not falling for that, understanding clearly, and they were small in number, that this was no measure of success. The amount of bodies didn't mean anything. They could be regenerated if you don't do something to stop the source of where they're coming from, or the motivation they have. It's like Osama bin Laden. And again, I see us now tactically trying to win this battle against extremism from the bottom up. And we actually declared war on the tactic terrorism. We're trying to cut finances, break down cells, kill leadership, or capture them. And yet he has an endless flow of angry young men coming in from the top, and we're not interdicting the flow. I mean, it takes you back to Vietnam. You can't win these things from the bottom up. Whatever the motivation that is stronger than the motivation to counter it in these societies, you have to address that motivation and then provide the motivation at the end you're supporting in these societies that would reject that.
Do you think we had to go through Vietnam to learn that? Because if you read the literature of the war, very few people were enthusiastic about this, but they kept moving forward because they felt they didn't have any good options of a way to get out. There were a couple of voices that said, declare victory and go home, or don't start at all. George Ball was telling Lyndon Johnson not to take that step to get in for all the reasons you've talked about in the Iraq War, but very few people saw that, and they just kept going forward because they thought that was less bad than the other alternative. Well,
I think there's some, you have to be careful at the lessons you draw for Vietnam and then say apply them to Iraq and other things. I think there are a couple lessons there. There was a strategic rationale for Vietnam, the domino theory and stopping communism. And at that time in our history, it was a zero-sum game. Everything in the world was up for grabs. You were either in the camp of the East or the West. And so we would fight these surrogate battles around the world, but it was really within the context of the struggle of us versus them. And to the American people, it made sense, because they saw this. I mean, the Soviets and the Chinese were trying to promote communism and influence all over the world. It could be some remote country in Africa or wherever. We were competing in our own southern hemisphere, in the African continent, in Southeast Asia. And lines had to be drawn. We saw in the Korean War where we were vague about the line being drawn and what had happened. So I think the strategic rationale, although it didn't pan out to be quite true, made sense. And so being in Vietnam in other times would have seemed to the American people maybe, why there? Why Vietnam? Why are we going to this remote, jungle infested area to do this business? But it made sense then. So there was sort of a strategic rationale. In order to find an even more, compelling reason, they made a mistake, and here's where you can draw parallels. The Gulf of Tonkin incident that was ginned up to make it clear to the American people. I think the parallel you can draw with Iraq, the strategic rationale which drove this was to change the Middle East, promote democracy. Out of the ashes, this would come up. But in order to shorthand, and then it was done within the strategic rationale of stemming extremism and terrorism. American people, again, it made sense and they bought into it. They didn't quite understand, didn't quite realize that this didn't fit. And then it was shorthanded to the WMD. And again, in both cases, the Gulf of Tonkin and the WMD proved false. So right away, your premise for going in there, in your attempt to simplify it into soundbite sellability, if you will, prove false. Right away, you get discredited by your own population supporting it. And then when the strategic rationale doesn't prove out, you begin to lose the will and the political support back here pretty clearly. So I think those were the initial flaws. The wrong strategic rationale, shorthanding it and creating an incident to sell it to the American people that eventually would be proven false. Those are lessons we should learn. And then I think the third lessons are the ones I mentioned. If you're not going to take the war to the base of the enemy, and you're not going to truly commit to a hearts and minds program, which may mean a commitment of occupation, dictation of forms of governance and other things, much like we did post-World War II, then you're fighting with one hand tied behind you, and you may be doomed to not be able to, quote, win this or get a victory in sort of a classic sense.
Let me ask a question. It seems like the basis for winning hearts and minds in the South was taking the war to the North, not just the air war, but the war in general, if I understand you correctly.
No, I think that had to be done to enhance the security situation. None of these things are going to work unless you have a secure environment, relatively secure environment. And I use the analogy, it's like building a house. Security or a secure environment's the foundation. It's not the house itself, but you can't build a house without that foundation. As long as the North was relatively free to create the violence, to generate it, to promote the insurgency, you were never going to have the security stability to then build the hearts and minds program. So, and they had to go hand in glove. Taking the war to the North didn't affect so much the hearts and minds in the South. There were political, social, and economic things that had to be done to do that. But they had to be done together.
Right. Well, this is what I want to ask about. The reason why the administration, both the Johnson administration and the Nixon administration, were very reluctant to do so was the parallel with what happened when we went across the 38th parallel in North Korea and the Chinese came in. And certainly by 71, 72, it was relatively clear that the Chinese understood the context better than we did and wouldn't. But at least in the Johnson administration, there was always that constraint that if we took the war to the North, we wouldn't know what would happen. And so would it have been responsible to do that under those circumstances?
Well, I mean, I can't, that's a different question. I mean, obviously I can tell you that if you said, I can't take the chance, the risk is too great, I'm going to fight this war without engaging the North and bringing the war home there, you were eliminating one of the two key requirements, I think, for the kind of victory you were after. You were dooming yourself to having to win every battle on the field in South Vietnam. In other words, one of the finest Marine generals that we've ever had, Ray Davis, Medal of Honor recipient, every award in combat from platoon up to division, and he said, when he commanded one of the 3rd Marine Division, was one of the most effective in his time, he used sort of a homespun analogy. He says, I'm a good old Georgia boy. He said, what you're asking me to do is sit on top of the corn crib and beat the rats one at a time as they come in when I want to go to the rat hole. I mean, and he was he used that sort of homespun way of talking to make a point. But, General Walt, General Davis, and many others, the senior leadership, made this point pretty clear. As long as you don't take the war to the source and the base, you're requiring us to fight a war that's going to be much more difficult to win. And I think without that piece and without the hearts and minds, which actually is something different, but that created the environment to allow it to do that, you were going to have a problem. It was clear to me the biggest fear that the enemy had, Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese, was not our military capability. I don't think they ever doubted that they had the upper hand, not in the sense that they could win battles, but they had time on their side. And they could engage or disengage at will. and they were in this for the long struggle. As long as they weren't touched at their bases or their ability to prosecute the war, they were deathly afraid of things that were happening that were hearts and minds. There was a small program that very few people talk about, the Revolutionary Development Cadres, that were created. These were black pajama, straw hat Vietnamese government representatives that came into villages that did work to help connect the government to the village. They provided funds and money and expertise, almost like a Peace Corps on steroids, if you will. They became the top target of the Viet Cong, more so than even the military forces. I mean, because that went right at the core of the insurgency. And, you know, and insurgents have to have one of three conditions amongst the people. It either have to have fear, apathy, or support from the people. You know, and it could be combinations of those. This is a lesson we can learn in Iraq today. As long as they can create an environment of a mix of fear, apathy, or support, that's the sea Mao talked about that the fish have to swim in, the fish being the insurgents. You have to turn that around. You have to make them unafraid. You have to be able to protect them. I mean, one of the tenets of counterinsurgency is the ability to protect the people and the infrastructure. That takes away fear. And then apathy is the second pillar, which is the environmental improvement. Whatever the conditions that led to the insurgency have to be changed. If it's poor governance, it's lack of economic and social institutions that are responsive to their needs, they have to be built. You know, so then you take away apathy. And eventually those that support it can be weaned away, or you can deal with them on the third pillar, which is to conduct the counter-guerrilla operations, the military and security operations. And that addresses each of these conditions. We really were not effective in either. We never could guarantee security, thus the fear. We never provided the institutions the motivation, the something to fight for, to take away the apathy. And you know, although we were marginally effective in some of the military operations, it wasn't strong enough to really defeat a military, again, that had a lot of freedom in its operations that we couldn't interdict in any way.
Maybe I could ask you a question or two about the Marine Corps in general and your experience in your career. The Marine Corps is an exceptional service, and they cultivate that reputation and that esprit and elan is part of their institutional identity, which I think contributes to their effectiveness. But it has downsides as well, and one of them that I'd like you to address is casualties. Why is it that the Marine Corps takes so many more casualties than the Army when they're engaged in comparable operations?
Well, I would say, first of all, I may argue the comparable. Mm-hmm. In Vietnam, we were in I Corps. Mm-hmm. I fought in all 4 Corps areas, and the Capital Military District run side. Every geographic division of South Vietnam I saw, and I saw the combat in there. And I would say clearly, and there were exceptions, but clearly on a day-to-day basis, you were facing North Vietnamese regulars. The combat was oftentimes conventional and pitched battles. So the nature of the combat in Vietnam in I Corps and where the Marines were was a lot more difficult, different, and intense. I would even say in some respects World War II, not to take away from certainly the magnificent performance of our Army and other forces, but when you went to the Pacific and the island campaigns, the direct assaults, the Marine Corps was actually structured to take casualties, because when you kick in the door, if you're a forcible entry force, that kind of assault, that kind of shock troop requirement is going to be casualty intensive. And that was the mission of the Marine Corps, to break those defenses down. There were no elegant ways to maneuver with an enemy in that kind of campaign. I mean, at a strategic level, you could bypass islands, but the ones you had to take and decided to take had to be done that way. At a tactical level, they were directly. And I would say that even going to Iraq, if you look at Anbar Province, where the Marines are, and look at the combat, and again, it's not to take away from the soldiers in Baghdad or elsewhere, but on a day-to-day basis, the Fallujahs, the Ramatis, those kinds of places have been the scenes of high-intensity combat. So I think we have to be careful to say that there's something about Marine tactics and Marine leadership that promote casualties. Mm-hmm. We have to look in each case as to where we were and what mission we were.
Why do the Marines consistently, as you've pointed out over the second half of the 20th century, why do they get those assignments? And I think your point is well taken.
I mean, you have to understand the Marine Corps, going back even before the all-volunteer force, with the exception of maybe World War II and Vietnam, They were all volunteer. It had a specific mission to conduct assaults, to be the shock troops, if you will. So I think when those that employ forces looked at the Marines, they looked at that role for them, and that was the expectation. That was the requirement. That was what it was understood as the mission of the Marine Corps. If you look at our infantry organization, it was always larger than Army formations, with the same comparable, say, straight leg infantry. And it was designed that way, from the 4-man fire team to the larger squads and on up, to be able to absorb the casualties and still push on because of the nature of the missions. The reputation of the Marines, the tradition of the Marines, I think made those that employ them understand that that's what they did and put them into harm's way in that. But I think we have to say today, and I'd be the first to say this as a Marine, we should not take away anything from our brothers and sisters in the other services who have demonstrated that kind of heroism and have been exposed to those levels of combat too, and have really, especially since the creation of the all-volunteer force, I think we've seen those other forces and services come up to that sense of pride, tradition, and willingness to engage on a day-to-day basis in those kinds of missions. And almost my entire general officer time was spent in the joint world, if you will. And I had an appreciation for all our services and what they commit to. Our services are different. Their cultures are different. Their traditions are different. Their missions are different. Their training is different in many ways. And how you apply them and where you use them is the art piece of this as a commander that you find the best suited. Even within a service, let's take the Army, for example, and I was always a big believer in the kinds of units that had diverse capabilities. So you saw an air assault division, an airborne division, a mountain division, a mechanized division, just within the infantry. And they all had a role. They all had a situation where they had a strength to play to, and they all had disadvantages or limitations you have to play to. And so I think in employing these, you play to the advantages that the service or the organization within the service provides. And that's the art of the operational art in joint warfare, as to how to apply the right force to the right situation.
Do you think that the Marine Corps as an institution has sought out these very challenging, risky missions in part because of concerns about its institutional survival? As you know, over history, there have been repeated calls for folding the Marine Corps into the Army, that there's no real need to keep them separate, especially as is happening in the modern world. They're both performing very similar kinds of ground combat.
I think if you were to fold the Marine Corps into another service, you would still find you would have to have a Marine Corps. Like you have an 18th Airborne Corps, and you still need the basic ability to project power from the sea. That's not a skill you do as sort of an additional duty. I mean, amphibious operations are the most complex and types of military operations, which have been proven in history. It takes a lot of skill, training, expertise, development of doctrine, even the equipment. For example, our helicopters have to be marinized, our ordnance has to be prepared in a special way for being aboard ship and all. So you would still have to have a Marine Corps. So the question becomes, should it be a separate service or should it not? Well, it's large enough to be a separate service. It's proven its capability as a separate service. I don't think you lose or gain anything by transferring it somewhere else. You may lose the focus and the emphasis and the commitment of resources in many ways if you did that. So, I think that argument has long passed. I think the Marine Corps is, General Krulak, Brute Krulak, wrote a book called First to Fight, where he discussed the rationale for the United States having the Marine Corps. And he begins the book by saying, you could do away with the Marine Corps. I mean, you could. Very few countries have a Marine Corps like ours. They may have naval infantry or Marine commandos, but a sizable force like we have that does what it does. We're unique in the world. But he then goes on to describe the advantages that gives to a nation like ours with its global responsibilities, its global interests, its global reach, the advantages of being able to project power from the sea, and why something of this size and this nature, as opposed to, say, Royal Marines with a few thousand commandos or naval infantry that basically doesn't have a self-contained capability for its own support, Again, being the nation that we are with the global responsibilities, unique to us is the requirement to have this capability that I think the Marine Corps fulfills. in an age when everything has to be justified and the world is changing, especially a force like the Marine Corps has to continually adapt, adjust to the modern requirements, prove its value. You probably don't have to prove an Air Force, a Navy, and an Army. You may have to prove size and strength in given times because it expands and contracts. But a Marine Corps, its very existence, I think, has to be justified. I actually think it's healthy. I think if you feel that sense of the need to justify it, you constantly make yourself more efficient, more effective. You analyze the environment and make yourself more applicable to the needs and the protection of the interests of the country, and it makes you a more viable force in the end.
I'm wondering if I could get you to expand a little bit on the whole question of how you train officers and how you teach people in universities, the whole pedagogical issue. In your book, you observe that it's wrong to use models and to think stereotypically about problems because lessons of the past don't apply everywhere. And the question is, and you basically say, experience is critical. So when you're teaching young officers to think outside the box or people at a higher level, how do you, aside from experience, do that? Do you have them read history? Do you create opportunities for them to do that? How do you go about teaching that?
Well, first of all, I think that traditionally, and maybe it's part of our national character, we look for short, definitive answers. We like prescriptions. We like soundbite solutions to complex problems. And I think that sort of carries over to our education system and our training and education of officers as well as anybody in universities and elsewhere. I think we don't do well in developing people that can see the depth and complexity of situations they face, to be able to analyze them across a broad set of dimensions. I'm a big believer that officers, and not just officers in the military, but maybe all leaders, need to have a broader education. Because as an officer today, especially as you move up the ranks, you're part economist, you're part diplomat, you're part soldier, you're part social anthropologist. You have to have those mix of things in today's environment. Battlefields aren't classically limited to military actions anymore, if they ever were. And so, and the military officers are tasked with operating in all these dimensions. They have to have a greater appreciation for cultures, for the dynamics of a society, for the political dimensions, the diplomacy and mediation, and understanding the economic interests and the economic conditions that are there, rule of law and other functions in a society. So how do you build someone that can develop the ability to operate this, to break away from prescriptions and checklists on how to do business? You have to broaden education. You have to give them real-world experiences, but I think you also can give them vicarious experiences through war games, simulations, and now with the technology, you can create these through all sorts of interactive means. The reading of history, the examination of history. It's not enough just to read history. You have to learn how to draw the lessons from it and apply them. And I think you build a bank of experiences, not just real. But the experiences come from all the dimensions, some of the things you mentioned, the reading and studying of history, going through the gaming, and I use that in a broadest context, what it might mean, simulations, sending officers out to have more of a global experience, a universal experience, making sure General Conway, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, has looked at the Marine Corps and said he has 60,000 Marines that haven't been to Iraq. And at the same time, he has Marines that have been there 3 and 4 times. And he wants to broaden that out. It's not just a sense of fairness and all. There's probably all sorts of rationale, and I'm sure all those Marines want to be there. But he sees the need to make sure I get this experience throughout my organization. It's going to be a valuable experience, regardless of how anyone may feel about the war one way or another. That experience is valuable to the institution as it goes forward. So, you have to build it so when people see a situation, they have a bank of these experiences, real and vicarious, that they can call on and see the trend lines, understand the complexity. I've told the story before about being in northern Iraq with the Kurds, and General Shalikashvili, who was the commander at the time, I think very prescient in believing we would see more of these kinds of operations where we go down there to a traumatized society and have to rebuild it, reconstruct it, resettle it in some way. And he told me, I was the deputy and chief of staff, he said, write up lessons we should draw from this. And my first reaction was, we have all these people writing lessons learned. Every service, the joint lessons learned system are out there. He said, no, they're down there picking up tactical lessons on equipment and technology. He said, this is broader. He said, this is for a commander that all of a sudden gets told he's going off to this mission and on the airplane to the scene of the crime should read this and get some sort of conceptual lesson, some real nuggets and principles. And I wrote, all this out. I thought I developed a masterpiece, that I drew the hard lessons at this that had universal application. And the next one I was involved in, planning and working in the Balkans, and then the next one in Somalia, I was erasing some of these and crossing them out, adding others, then erasing those and adding others. And pretty soon, after about the third or fourth one, I said, there aren't any. I mean, there are a few maybe very broad, basic hearts and minds, things we discussed, but there aren't any lessons that you can draw from a single experience and then bet the ranch on them at the next one and try to apply them to sort of hammer to fit. And I see us make that mistake with officers that go through one experience and swear they've now touched the holy stone here and have the answer. And what you need is people that their minds are open. They can see the complexity. They can understand the context this is in, cultural context, the economic, political, social ramifications, the unique security situation they're in, that are imaginative, that are innovative, leadership that is decentralized, that provides for initiative. In Somalia, I said that the most effective officers we had were the Mavericks, that their careers were pretty much over in their services because they were Mavericks. They didn't fit the mold. And we had a collection of these somehow in Somalia. They were brilliant. I mean, when we were trying to create recreate the judicial system, the police force, and work with the people there, I was finding these Mavericks that were outcasts. They were outliers in their services because they thought outside the box. They were tremendously valuable because they forced you outside the prescriptions. And I think you need to encourage those, and you need those in the system. As a commander-in-chief of U.S. Central Command, some of the most valuable officers I had are what we call the foreign area specialists, foreign area officers, FAOs. In each of the services, the FAOs are killed for taking that course. In other words, these are artillerymen or aviators or infantry officers that at some point in their career say, I want to pursue a foreign area specialty. They learn the language. They go off to courses to study. Let's say they become African specialists or Middle East specialists. They get a tour as an attaché. They get a tour in security assistance, as a planner on the staff of one of the regional unified commands. Well, when they go back to compete against their brother artillery officers and infantry officers, they're killed for promotion. Yet they're the most important officers we need in these environments now. And we've never been able to accommodate those within the military, because we tend to reinforce the system that we grew up in if we're going to determine promotion and advancement. And we don't like somebody that ran outside the box. And maybe there isn't this appreciation that we need this broader set of experiences. I believe, we have the same retirement system as the Roman army. 2,000 years later, we ought to say that you have a life expectancy and a set of health conditions that service beyond 20 years or 30 years. Certainly, I don't know of any business that would throw somebody out that they've developed and has 20 years worth of experience and commitment. Why can't we stretch it out and give people more time and grade so that you can accommodate both needs? I can be the artillery officer, but at the same time, I can have this other track. If we need officers with broader education, broader sets of experience, you have to give them the time to do that. The demands of time now, a young officer that doesn't get his command, his joint staff, his educational opportunity, plus his MOS particular requirements, all crammed into a 2 or 3 year window in a selection zone, he's out of luck. And so in many cases, you get snippets of the experience, and it doesn't permit you to broaden out into what we need today. So, why can't we spend 8 or 10 years in a given grade so that you can allow these experiences? Why do we put people out enlisted in officer when they're 38 and 40 years old? In business now, that's the prime. at the 20-year mark. You still see people with the knowledge, the wisdom, the sets of experience that you'd love to keep around, and you're forced out into a system that it's past its utility. And so I think there are ways you can adjust and create that kind of leader.
One follow-up on the issue of cultural sensitivity. It seems from your experience in Vietnam that was one of the big things that you got out of that experience. And particularly dealing with the Iraqis and the Kurds in northern Iraq and with Aidid in Somalia, your sensitivity, for example, to the tribal-based culture or the clannishness probably affected profoundly the way in which you sought solutions to those problems. If you could sort of articulate key lessons that you drew from those experiences that you would pass on to people in terms of this is an example of how cultural sensitivity can affect decisions you make, how would you elaborate on those?
Well, I think, we bring our own culture into a given situation. And oftentimes we have an assumption of superiority of our culture, but even worse yet, we have a set of concepts and beliefs about societies and human interactions that are based on our culture. A culture, after all, is an evolution coming from belief systems, geography, history that creates a set of concepts that a society structures itself around. I think you have to understand those because you make assumptions, and I found all sorts of examples, going back to Somalia, where we made this assumption that the idea of individual responsibility should be carried out here, and we're in an environment where there was no concept of individual responsibility. It was only clan ability to accept responsibility. An individual act had to be in some way dealt with and justice provided through clan interaction. You do hold your brother and your father and your uncle accountable for your actions, and the clan has to accept or deny responsibility, and the denial leads to conflict. The acceptance means the payment of a blood tax or whatever. These are alien to us. But if you go into a situation where you put rewards on the heads of individuals and then go to war with clans, you don't understand your clan has just declared war and not accepted a clan mediation to this. That's one example. The basic concept of will and how we in a Christian Judeo culture believe we have a sense of free will and control over our destiny. We make decisions, we're held accountable for them, but our decisions lead to the result. Where maybe you're in a society that it's the will of a supreme being that makes the ultimate determination. It's nothing you do that affects the outcome. The only way you affect a favorable outcome is by being a better person. And so it's not a matter of taking the right action. So here's this American saying, if you do this, this, and that, this will happen. And I'm saying to you, inshallah, if it's God's will, it's going to happen. These actions aren't going to determine it. And so I got to go off and be a better person to make this happen, where you're saying I got to roll up my sleeves and make it happen. It's a subtly different approach to this, and it leads to confusion in many ways. And those are just two examples of fundamental conceptual differences, where our loyalty, we identify ourselves as Americans. We sort of have a top-down loyalty. Where maybe they begin by identifying themselves as a tribal nature. In some of the courses I teach, I always ask students, particularly ROTC students, would you put your life on your line for your country? Absolutely. How about your county? And they kind of laugh at that. My county? Some of them didn't even know what county they grew up in. But I said, think of a society where maybe county equals tribe, extended family, clan, that the loyalties begin there. That when you start talking about fighting as an Iraqi, fighting as a South Vietnamese, maybe it doesn't have the same kind of sense of commitment and strength of loyalty that we have here. So you're operating with a different loyalty construct, and to begin with. Those are just some examples of where cultures could lead you to a remarkably different place in a different way. If you want to understand how, for example, Arabs think, you have to understand the desert. You have to understand Bedouin culture. You didn't take risks in the desert because you died. You better know where you're going water hole to water hole. It's a hostile, extreme environment. It leads to the way you develop your thought processes, your constructs for dealing with things and making decisions. George Tenet came to my headquarters at one time at CENTCOM, and when he came down, he asked me, he says, tell me how to understand your part of the world, is the way he phrased it. And I said, George, you're the director of Central Intelligence. You see all the intelligence, the data, and the analysis. Why are you asking me? He says, I see it all. I don't know how to put it in context. He said, what do I need to know about your part of the world? And I thought about it for a while, and I gave him some, 8 basic things to understand: Islam, the desert, the Bedouin culture, the colonial history, things like this. And these are the books I recommend. These are the people you should talk to. These are the places you need to go to experience it and get the sense. And then when you read these things, you put them in that context. Again, a cultural context, because all those things contribute to the evolution of a culture. And it would maybe help you understand why it is what it is, or why it's done the way it's done. And I think as much as we do a military estimate of the situation, where we look at mission, enemy, terrain, troops available, we need to throw that cultural aspect into these estimates, especially at a strategic and operational level. And that doesn't get done. And it causes the failures like we've seen in Iraq and elsewhere.
Haven't you given us in some ways 2 different pieces of advice? On the one hand, you say that when we're dealing with these countries, we must control our own hubris, not assume that our cultural view of the world is one to be superimposed upon them and to be responsive of their culture and their worldview. But at the same time, when the United States has been drawn into many of these instances, it's because it's a failed state. It's because their culture isn't working, their society isn't working, their politics aren't working. And as you said, in some of these instances, we have to take over as occupier, and we just simply tell them what's in their own best interest. How do you balance those two things?
Therein lies the trick. And I would offer as an example of how it was balanced was MacArthur. I mean, he didn't have much support back here for keeping the emperor as a figurehead or some sort of leadership role in Japanese society. But he saw the importance of developing a representative government, a democracy, but he had to bring forth some parts of the culture and retain it to have that right blend or balance. And that's what I'm saying, that you could have a broken system. I mean, obviously you look at Iraq, the governance of Saddam Hussein and maybe all his predecessors were not anything you wanted to repeat. You weren't after Jeffersonian democracy. That's the hubris that you're talking about, to think we're going to implant that, something very unique to us in many respects. But you should be promoting representative democracy that can fit within the cultural context of Arabs and Iraqis. So if that were your goal in terms of developing governance institution, it's a much different goal than saying we're going to implant democracy. And then, as we always do, shorthanded, democracy equals an election. So we had all these events of people dipping fingers in ink that were meaningless. I mean, to develop a representative government, you have to first develop the institution of the government that everybody, and then make sure everybody understands it. There has to be an education of the electorate. You have to develop political parties that have platforms and a basis for what they represent that are understood by the people. The last event is the election, not the first event in a representative government, because it leads to confusion. I was pulling out of my garage at one point during the first election, and I had an NPR station on. And they were in Basra at one of the polling stations. And while they were there, this woman came in screaming in Arabic that this is the greatest day in her life. She was a Shia, and she was going to be able to vote, a woman and a Shia in Iraq. I mean, a remarkable day. And she ran in, and they were recounting how she dipped her finger in the ink, and she ran up to one of the poll watchers, and she said, "Who do I vote for?" And the poll watcher says, "Well, I can't tell you who to vote for. It's inappropriate." She said, "Well, I have to vote. It's the greatest day of my life." Everybody's telling her that, and it is. But you don't know who to vote for. He said, the best I can do is read the list of political parties. And he starts down, there's 160-some parties. He starts down at number 7, he hits the Islamic Party or something other. That's what I'm voting for. Well, why are you voting for that? He said, it's got Islam in the title. Now, we have created democracy. We created democracy in the Palestinian territories. We have Hamas. We create a democracy in Iraq, and look what we get. If we did it in Egypt today, we'd have the Muslim Brotherhood. Is that what really we're promoting? We created the first Shia Arab state. Is that right or wrong? Who knows? But it's the first one. It has tremendous ramifications. Was it our intent to do that? Did we understand the cultural implications and the complexity and the regional impact and all that? Of course not. We weren't even thinking that deeply. I mean, some people were that were cautioning this, because it's not to say that the majority shouldn't rule, but it's to say in that society what it represents and what it means culturally could have all sorts of electricity attached to it that goes throughout the region. And you'd better understand it. And without that cultural understanding, you unleash things in the second, third order effects and consequences that were not intended or certainly aren't understood.
Well, clearly my understanding of your sense of Vietnam is that the lessons there are very different than other people have drawn. One of the ones I'm interested in hearing your comment on is, for want of a better term, the Weinberger Doctrine, the Powell Doctrine, which I guess in the post-Cold War era raises real questions about how we ought to be thinking about engagements that we get involved in, because they're not like World War II. I'm wondering if you could comment on those, combine them into one doctrine, and both the good and bad things about that concept.
I think that first of all, the Weinberger Doctrine, I think, was clearly drawn from the lessons of Vietnam, and it's different than the Powell Doctrine, and not necessarily that they're not compatible, but Weinberger Doctrine basically was telling us, be sure what your cause is and your rationale for war is. Make sure you got it right. Then make sure the American people are behind you when you do this, and then commit to it. And commit to it means, the application of force or whatever you need to do. So it was more about a greater depth in strategic thinking and a greater depth in getting the commitment of the American people behind whatever you do. You aren't the king. You're an elected representative, and without the will of the American people, which is one of our strengths, but also one of our vulnerabilities. It is a center of gravity for us at a strategic level, and bad guys know that now. So I think that was the major message of the Weinberger Doctrine. The Powell Doctrine, which often gets shorthanded into overwhelming force, but I don't think that's what Roland was saying. I think what he was saying is overwhelm the situation. It didn't mean necessarily force in just military terms, in numbers of troops and boots on the ground, although that could be an element of it. What he was saying is apply all your elements of power to the situation. Overwhelm it with your diplomacy, your economic power, your military power. Confuse the potential adversary by opening up all sorts of fronts. The real application of the Powell Doctrine was the Gulf War, if you think about it. We could have gone in there with the military force, kicked the crap out of Saddam Hussein, easily. But what did we do? We first went to the UN, painstakingly achieved a UN resolution giving authority to do this. So he opens up the front of international legitimacy. Right away, Iraq is stuck not only regionally. Saddam's trying to incite Muslim Brotherhood in all this. No appeal. The international community, the Muslim world comes together. We build this tremendous Muslim force, coalition. Schwarzkopf has this remarkably difficult dual parallel chain of command to manage, with Prince Khalid heading those forces. We go to Turkey. We convince the Turks to let us open up a second front coming down through that area. Everything, including the massive numbers of soldiers and troops. If you look at everything else we did there, we stay within the context of the UN resolution. We provide for the containment of this force. We stop on the road to death from complete slaughter and going that way. We open up a moral, a diplomatic, a military, even a social front. We overwhelm the situation by deftly using all our elements of power. And I think that's the Powell message. It gets shorthanded to say, throw a lot of troops in. And to a certain extent, in situations like this, you have to control the situation. You have to cut off the borders. You have to control the population, protect the resources, protect your own lines of communication. That's not enough in and of itself. Within that structure and that construct, you have to be building the other institutions. But that was the message, I think, of the Powell Doctrine. And I think both have tremendous applicability today. I mean, the mistake if the so-called Rumsfeld Doctrine was to now say that was passé. And again, it was not understanding the true dimension of the Powell Doctrine in all its fullness, but dismissing it at a time when it was more applicable than ever, I think, now.
This raises the political question. One of the criticisms of both the Weinberger and the Powell Doctrine is that in some ways they represent the military telling the political arm of the society when they can and cannot use military force, or when they should and should not use military force. Do you think that steps over the line of appropriate civil-military relations?
I wouldn't take it that way. I think it was more a caution to the decision makers, not challenging their authority, but saying, if you use us, from our experience, this is what we need. It would be like going before Congress and saying, if you're going to commit us to do this, these are the resources we need. These are the conditions that aren't material resources that you need to be successful. I think it's the right kind of advice coming from the military. the problem, when I was at CENTCOM, I was asked by the then Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright. She had a dinner at the State Department with several retired 4-stars, and I was the only active duty one, and one or two of her people at State Department. And she brought us together up there one evening, and she said, I have a problem, I have a dilemma I need you to help me with. She said, how do you use limited force to achieve limited objectives with limited resources? Because she said, that's what we seem to face all the time. Now, she was in the throes of the Balkans, Haiti, all these, Somalia, where there's a finite amount of commitment you're going to make, a finite amount of resources and treasure you're willing to expend, a finite amount of military power you're willing to put up there and casualties to suffer, and you have very limited interest and objectives in these situations. I mean, some of them may be more altruistic and more moral than they are material. Some of them, even if they're material, may be limited in a certain sense. If you trap yourself into the situation where you can only fight World War II, when it's only unconditional surrender, total commitment, the highest objectives, it's issues of only survival that you put and apply military force, you've limited yourself, and you have a tremendous element of power you can't employ other than in ultimate conflict. And so her dilemma was one that we always have. How do you commit it for lesser objectives? Because you will face more times than you will the lesser conditions. When do presidents know that this is about all I can do? When do you cut off the Somalias? When do you cut off the Beiruts? When do you cut off the Vietnams and other places? What is it you're willing to do? You can't up front say you'll never commit force to any of these, because you're going to expose yourself to all sorts of challenges. And you basically said to the enemy, I'm ceding to you most of the field in that set of conditions. We've never answered that question. And the Weinberger Doctrine particularly seems to run counter to that. I believe it's because we haven't been able to understand how to convey to the American people we have these sorts of requirements, and they have to understand that you can't fight and commit force in perfect conditions, with perfect moral clarity, with perfect declaration of interest, with perfect determination to go that it is a survival issue and it requires total commitment. And so these are the things that have confounded virtually every president we've had going back to Harry Truman, post-Second World War, and one we need to think about and be able to answer and articulate to the American people.
You have said in your writing and in your visit here that, quoting you at one point, you said that the post-Cold War administrations in the United States, that is the two Bush administrations and the Clinton administration, have lacked a coherent, integrated strategy for dealing with security issues around the world. And you back that up with extensive criticism of the way the security apparatus in Washington works, the way the political system works, and many of our problems are self-created. And you've proposed what I see as a series of reforms designed to add more rationality and efficiency to the decision-making apparatus and strategy development apparatus. I wonder if that isn't unrealistic in a democracy like ours. I mean, do you really think that a set of reforms, which I think most people would agree would be beneficial, are really possible?
Well, it's always difficult to alter a huge bloated bureaucracy because it becomes so powerful. It moves on its own momentum. People that grow up in that system and are comfortable with it, have power, have achieved it, want to perpetuate it. So for all those reasons, it is difficult to change. But and usually that change in structures like that only come about through major defeats or failures, or through innovative, enlightened legislation and leadership. I mean, Truman did maybe the last major restructuring of the government in its entirety in the 1947 National Security Act. There were amendments that followed, but that was a remarkable reconstruction. In the military, it was Goldwater Nichols in the mid-'80s, and it was fought and resisted by the powerful bureaucracy of the services. But it did something that was key. The key first step is integration. If you use the model of business today, no business can function with heavily layered, stovepiped, isolated, functional organizations. Let's use the business model where you have human resources, you have production, you have finance, where they're stovepipe. They only come together at the tops. They aren't integrated on a day-to-day basis and at the tactical level. They have too many levels now, given the ability to control more because of technology, access to information. Businesses flattening organizations, teaming more, using integrated approaches with these functions to make decisions, to be more competitive in the marketplace. The same thing applies in sort of the global responsibilities we have on development of foreign policy, national security strategies. We see the 9/11 Commission and the Congressional Commission on 9/11 criticize our intelligence community and our homeland security by saying, aha, we found the faults. They didn't talk to each other. They didn't share information. They didn't integrate their planning. We see in Iraq where the plans on the battlefield had a military plan that didn't have the other components, which caused the failure, the political, economic, social components of reconstruction. Yet what do we do as a solution to this? We create more stovepipe bloated bureaucracy. Department of Homeland Security, the National Intelligence Directorate. We didn't do something as clever as Goldwater Nichols did. They created what I call in the book integrating agencies. And how do you create an integrating agency? Those agencies that support it, that are non-communicative and integrating, they have a functional responsibility you can't eliminate. In government, it's State Department, Department of Defense, and other agencies. You need to find agencies that bring them together, that look across the spectrum, that fill in the holes and gaps, that account for the differences in maybe the way they see things. And what Goldwater Nichols did for the services, and if you add special operations, the 5 services, if you will, it created this joint structure, but it said in order for you not to feel challenged or threatened by it, you're going to participate, have representation, and a sense of ownership. Use services, use stovepipes. You have to serve a tour in these. If you want to get promoted, this ensures quality people. If you're a Marine, let's say, you're going to serve a tour as an officer or senior enlisted in a joint command. You need that for promotion. It's a requirement. But when you go there and serve that tour, you come back to your service. So you see both worlds. The services are manning it. It isn't a class of mandarins as feared by the services, a purple organization like we created in Homeland Security and NID that is separate in and of itself. It is manned and serviced by the highest quality people of the agencies it needs to bring together. And within that organization, each service has a component. If you go to CENTCOM or UCOM or one of these services, you'll see an Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps Special Operations component. So they are represented. They make up the fundamental part of this. So very innovatively, Goldwater Nichols found a way to create, again, what I call integrating agencies. What 9/11 Commission failed to do, what the Congressional Commission failed to do when it looked at Homeland Security, is we don't have integrating agencies. We don't know how to build those. Just creating another agency, manning it separately, not having that sense of participation, ownership, and representation from the others, and saying it exists to integrate, it can't by its own nature. It is another stovepiped agency. But in addition to that, I mentioned in the book, it's beyond just a structural problem, which is the primary problem in our government, has to be addressed. We can't do business in the world with bloated, structured, non-communicative bureaucracy anymore. But it's practices like patronage and earmarks that everybody complains about. We complain about Brownie and FEMA and 8 of the 12 people that were not qualified to deal with natural resources in the top echelons of FEMA. We complain about earmarks and waste and pet projects of senators and congressmen and women, the bridges to nowhere and that sort of thing. Yet we do nothing about it by fixing it. The real question becomes, this is where I'm try to sound the alarm. You can't continue like this. No president can execute a vision, can analyze the new changed world, see the environment for what it is, and build a strategy. Even if he's capable of doing that, or she, and develops it, if they throw it into this system, it's going to be defeated. It can't be implemented in any way. So partly we don't have a view of this new changed world, and we lack a strategy, therefore, to deal with it, express our interests, and know what to do with it. But even more importantly, we don't even have the structure and the practices to allow us to function in this changed world. We are slow, we are hidebound, we are isolated, we are unimaginative, we are isolating ourselves from the realities of this world, and we have a bloated system that contributes to that. And I think that's going to get us in trouble down the road,
We
more
could-
than we've already
We could
been.
do this endlessly. I'd love to do one quick follow-up on the structural issue, and then perhaps we'll get a chance to talk about the larger issues of democratic polity. The one other structural occurrence I would put in there is the Defense Reorganization Act of 1958, because Eisenhower wrestled with inter-service rivalry, and he was trying to get a strong Secretary of Defense, and the result is we get a McNamara or a Rumsfeld. That is, one way to break down these stovepipes is to bring in a powerful integrative leader who forces these groups to work together. Would you comment on McNamara and Rumsfeld as Secretaries of Defense?
Well, they had if you took the Rumsfeld-McNamara philosophy, and counter to that was the Goldwater-Nichols philosophy, because Goldwater-Nichols decentralized power, decentralized Washington power with regional power, really presented in many respects a more diverse set of views that could be forwarded through many channels. If you go back to the original creation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and its intention was to have military advice separate from national security advice. In other words, the chairman has certain responsibilities directly to the president, not just through the Secretary of Defense. Although the McNamaras and Rumsfelds wanted to clamp down on that, and everything comes through them, there was no view that could be expressed, a uniform view separately, and there are dangers with that. You have to be careful with that, but that's the way it was structured. The problem we have with the centralized control, the pre-Goldwater-Nichols mentality that's been reinstated by Rumsfeld, it centralizes everything in Washington, not just all the decision-making down to numbers of troops in the field, and sort of strips and emasculates the military from its role and what's their prerogatives and input, but it doesn't invite other views. We'll go back to the point about cultures and environment and situations. The last four commanders of CENTCOM, General Schwarzkopf, General Hord, General P, and myself, all voiced concerns about Iraq at one level or another, some more strongly than others, but all said, you're about to make some big, gigantic mistakes here. This is the view from people that have been out there over the last decade or more. That was all ignored and blown off. In the Goldwater-Nichols context, that voice would have been heard. It may not have been decided to pursue it, but that voice would have been heard. Those issues would have been heard. In the McNamara-Rumsfeld environment, that's stifled. There are mechanisms within the system that allow that to happen, the congressional testimony. You have an obligation to testify on your honest views, even if it's opposed to administration policy. That's the condition you accept when you're confirmed by the Senate. And you saw Rick Shinseki demonstrate that and do that. But then the intimidation, the humiliation, the suppressing, the punishment in the aftermath obviously send a chilling message throughout the ranks, and the hard decisions that senior officers have to take. My solution to this problem would be, first of all, I think that Joint Chiefs of Staff the construct is wrong, have not served the president well. Did not serve the president well in Korea after its creation, did not serve it well in Vietnam, did not serve it well in the first Gulf War, did not serve it well in Iraq. And you can go back and look at all those and see the situation. So he didn't get the best military advice. He didn't get the best support in dealing with MacArthur or honest and true feelings about the conduct of the war. He read dereliction of duty, and during the Gulf War there was confusion. One of them was relieved, and their role vis-a-vis the General Schwarzkopf and the Sink became confused. In Iraq they were absent. They weren't there at all. So what's wrong with the system? Well, you have the service chiefs, the providers, that suddenly are identified as the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's a contradiction. I had an experience with a congressman that came to my headquarters at CENTCOM and said, we did a great thing in the House Armed Services Committee the other day. We're going to kill the funding for the joint exercises. I said, great thing. You just killed my exercises. I said, we exercise. He said, but when the Joint Chiefs testified, they said this is really hurting them. I said, well, I exercise in the theater where you're going to fight. I exercise with the coalition forces you're going to fight with. I exercise in the environment you're going to fight in the desert. I exercise the war plans you're going to fight. Now, the service chiefs want you to fund their exercises at 29 Palms, California, Fort Irwin, the National Training Center, Nellis Air Force Base, or Fleet X, whatever, off the coast of the west or the east of the United States. And I says, they have needs for there, but this is the competition. And he looked at me and he said, well, that wasn't explained to us, but these were the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Well, wait a minute. Were they testifying as the Joint Chiefs of Staff or the Chief of Staff of the Army, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, the Commandant of the Marine Corps? Well, he looked at me in confusion. How can you be both? I mean, in the military top structure, you have providers, trained, organized, and equipped. These are service chiefs. You have integrators. This is Space Command, Strategic Command, Special Operations Command, Transportation Command, and then you have the employers of the forces, the regional commands, European Command, Pacific Command, Central Command, Southern Command. They each have a role. At some level, their advice comes from a different direction. With limited resources and the ability to make decisions, you need to hear three voices. You only hear one voice. So, and then that voice can be stifled by a dominant Secretary of Defense who has a particular strategic vision. In the case of Rumsfeld, he had a neocon vision. Not that he was a neocon, but it was a neocon strategy he wanted executed. The military advice that would have exposed all the flaws in that strategic thinking were not allowed to be voiced, where they were in previous administrations. You know, and that becomes a challenge. The approach that McNamara had to the battlefield in Vietnam, the voices of the military who knew that wasn't working or wouldn't work did not have a means or the willingness or the guts or however you want to phrase it to speak up. Therefore, you have the dereliction of duty books.
Let me ask, we've got about 4 minutes left, so this might give you a chance to talk a little bit about the Iraq War. One of the points you made in your book was that there was no one agency directing interagency cooperation, so the military got stuck with reconstruction or nation building. And one response to that is, yeah, but that's what DOD wanted, and that's what the White House let them do. And the question is, was there any mechanism that could have, a better run NSC that could have insisted that the State Department be brought in as Powell thought they would be? Or is this something that was beyond anyone's control?
Well, first of all, the military was told that it wouldn't do the quote phase 4 piece. Phase 4 is the reconstruction. And it mistakenly, this is something General Franks has to answer, and I haven't had this conversation with him, but he accepted that. I wouldn't have accepted that. I would have said, look, I've been down this road before. I've been stung before. You can't, if you're going to tell me I stop at the high water mark, when I pull the statue down in Baghdad and Saddam's gone, then my job is over, other than maybe providing a little security that there's a quote phase 4 force coming in. Show me that force. And that's what should have happened, because if they would have shown him the Office of Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance, this little small staff running around Kuwait that couldn't even find its way to Baghdad, actually got lost at the war going up there, I would have said, you've got to be kidding me. This isn't going to work. Mr. President, I have to see you, or I have to go to Congress, or I have to put my stars on the table and go out and speak that you're about to screw this up. They are incapable of the reconstruction of this society. You don't know what you're unleashing here, and you don't have an organization to handle this. They don't have the wherewithal to do politically, to do socially, to do economically, and otherwise what you're asking me to do, that we have the capability to do in a security sense, although I would have objected to the numbers of troops because it was woefully inadequate. It was adequate enough to take down the regime, but any fool would know that from the time you cross the line of departure, you're into reconstruction. And unless you're controlling things, unless you're controlling the people and the resources and the infrastructure, somebody's going to come in and try to change the order and work against you. So the military should have clearly spoken up at that point, saying unacceptable. That would have been where I would have taken that step.
Do we have any time left? 1 minute. Can you comment in 45 seconds on the politicization of intelligence?
Yeah, I think we've clearly seen that as a result of this weapons of mass destruction business, that we put pressure on the intelligence community. We wanted it to say what we wanted to. It buckled to that. It should not have allowed itself to happen. And I think it's damaged the intelligence community and its credibility internationally and with the American people, and that has to be regained in some form.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thanks.
thank you,
This was
Alex.
wonderful. Very good.
Thank you, General Zinni.
Thank you, Bruce.